The killer on the cruise ship. Can anyone survive? Hook. On a cruise ship lost at sea, a killer hunts down the last survivors. But just when escape seems possible, a terrifying twist changes everything. Will Lena survive, or will the nightmare follow her to the very end? Stay tuned to discover the shocking truth, because nothing is as it seems on the open water. The ship shuddered beneath her feet. Lena tightened her grip on the railing. The sea was eerily still, a glassy expanse stretching into the night. The only sound was the muffled hum of the engines. Then, something shifted in the shadows, too fast to catch. Her heart raced. She spun around, searching. The deck was empty, as it had been for the past hour. The crew was supposed to be on shift, but no one was around. The light above flickered. Lena felt a cold breath of wind brush against her neck. She spun again. Nothing. The hairs on her neck stood tall. Something was wrong. Her footsteps echoed in the silence as she moved down the corridor. She heard a door creak open in the distance. Then, the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps. Someone was there. Her pulse quickened. She turned the corner sharply. A shadow darted across the hallway, disappearing into the darkness. "Who's there?" Lena's voice was barely a whisper. No response. She pulled her phone from her pocket, but the screen remained black. She was alone. The flickering lights above her cast strange, distorted shadows on the walls. A door slammed open in front of her. Lena froze. The room was empty. Or was it? A faint smell lingered in the air, metallic. She stepped closer to the doorway. Her breath caught in her throat. The door creaked, then slammed shut behind her. Her heart skipped. A figure stood in the corner of the room, still as stone. The pale face of a man, his eyes wide open, stared back at her. Lena gasped. He wasn't breathing, but his eyes were alive, locked onto hers. The air felt thick, suffocating. Then she heard the soft scrape of metal behind her. Turning, Lena saw the glint of a knife. Someone was coming. She wasn't alone. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She backed away slowly, eyes never leaving the figure. It was too dark to make out the details, but she could feel its presence, cold, menacing. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her legs felt like lead. The figure didn't move, but she could sense its gaze burning into her. Every second stretched into eternity. Lena glanced down at the body. The blood had already started to darken, pooling around the lifeless form. Her feet shuffled back, inching toward the exit. The air grew heavier with each step. Then a voice broke the silence. Soft, low. "You're not supposed to see this." The words chilled her to the core. She whipped around, but the figure was gone, just like that. The darkness seemed to swallow the room whole. Lena turned back to the hallway. She needed to get out. She needed to warn someone. But the corridor was different now. The blood trail had vanished. The ship creaked ominously beneath her feet. Was she losing her mind? The lights flickered once more, then went out. Total darkness. Lena's heart pounded, her pulse racing. Her hands reached out, desperately searching for anything to hold on to. She moved forward, faster now, feeling the walls as she went. Then, the soft sound of footsteps again. Closer, closer. Her breath caught in her throat. They were behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing. No one. Lena stumbled back, her eyes searching frantically. Then a voice again, whispering right in her ear. "You're not going anywhere." She froze, a cold, damp breath on her neck. And then nothing. Silence. Lena couldn't take it anymore. She ran down the narrow corridor, her shoes pounding against the floor. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. But the ship felt like it was shifting beneath her. The walls closed in. The air grew colder. The darkness was all-encompassing. Her hands reached out, touching something warm. Blood. Warm blood. She recoiled. Then a figure emerged from the shadows. The killer. This time, she could see him. The man from the corner. His face was pale, eyes hollow. A twisted grin spread across his face. He stepped closer, raising the knife. Lena had nowhere left to run. Lena pushed herself to her feet. Her body ached, bruised and battered from the escape, but she had no time to rest. The silence in the room felt unnatural. It pressed in on her, suffocating. Her hands gripped the shelves around her, trying to steady herself. She could still hear the pounding of her heart in her ears. The dim light from the hallway seeped under the door, casting long, trembling shadows. She knew he was still out there. The killer hadn't stopped. Her breath came in quick bursts. She needed to think, to plan, but her thoughts were a blur, spinning out of control. The ship groaned again, a low, ominous sound. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the killer anymore. The ship felt alive, as though it were responding to the fear that clung to her. Lena crept toward the small window in the storage room. It was too small to escape through, but she needed to see outside, to see if there was anyone else. Her fingers gripped the cold metal frame. She peered through the glass. Nothing but endless black water. She looked up. A silhouette moved against the backdrop of the night sky. The figure was tall, dark, and familiar. Her breath caught. It was him, the killer. He was standing at the edge of the deck, staring out into the darkness. Lena backed away from the window. She had to make her move. She couldn't stay hidden forever. Her mind raced, searching for a way out. A loud crash echoed from somewhere on the ship. The lights flickered, and in that moment of darkness, she heard it. A whisper. "You're not going anywhere." It was right behind her. Lena spun around, but the room was empty. Her pulse skyrocketed. Was he playing with her? Toying with her mind? The door behind her creaked open. A figure stepped inside. Just a shadow at first. Then it emerged fully into the dim light. It was him, standing knife in hand. The man's eyes were wide, unblinking. A cold, sickening smile curled at the edges of his lips. Lena's instinct screamed for her to run, but her feet were rooted to the floor. "Why?" she managed to whisper, her voice trembling. The killer tilted his head slightly, as though confused by the question. "You should have known," he replied softly, almost gently. "Known what?" A low laugh rumbled from his throat. "You're not the first," he whispered. Then, with lightning speed, he lunged. Lena barely dodged in time, feeling the cold steel of the blade brush against her arm. She gasped in pain, but didn't stop. Her legs carried her back into the hallway, adrenaline pushing her forward. The killer followed, relentless. Each step echoed louder, closer. She turned a sharp corner, desperate. And then she saw it. The lifeboat station. She was so close, but her vision blurred with panic. The killer was gaining. She felt the heat of his breath on her neck. This was it. No more hiding. No more running. The lifeboat rocked gently in the waves, but Lena felt no comfort in the motion. Her hands trembled as she gripped the sides, her body still tight with fear. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Her eyes darted across the dark water, searching for any sign of life. But all she saw was the endless expanse of night. The ship was nothing but a shadow on the horizon now. She didn't know what had happened, if the killer was truly gone, or if he was still out there watching. The thought made her stomach twist. Her eyes kept drifting to the horizon, as though she were waiting for something, someone. But nothing came. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. She didn't have a radio. No signal. She was alone. The cold wind bit at her skin. But it wasn't the cold that had her shivering. It was the silence, the weight of the unknown. Her thoughts kept circling back, to the killer, his eyes, his smile, the way he had seemed to know her every move. Had she really escaped? Or was he watching her from the dark waters now? She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see his silhouette standing on the ship's deck, knife raised in the air. But there was nothing, only the quiet, endless expanse of the ocean. Lena let out a shaky breath. Her mind played tricks on her. The isolation was wearing her down. She couldn't stay in the lifeboat forever. There had to be land somewhere. She tried to focus on what was ahead. She needed to survive. The soft lapping of the water against the boat was strangely comforting now, a lullaby for the terrified. But even as her body started to relax, a sharp chill ran down her spine. Was that movement in the water? She squinted into the blackness, straining her eyes. Nothing, just the rolling waves. Her pulse slowed, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to breathe. But then she heard it, a splash, a soft, deliberate sound. Lena froze, her heart leaping into her throat. It came again, closer this time. A shadow passed under the boat. She jerked upright, scanning the water, but saw nothing. Her breath hitched. A figure moved beneath the surface, just out of reach, but there. She couldn't see its face, but she knew. The killer hadn't stopped. He was still here to... Lena's heart pounded in her chest, the sound of it deafening in her ears. Her eyes flicked over the water again, scanning for any sign of movement. The splash came again, closer this time, as if something large was circling beneath her. Her breath came in shallow gasps. The boat rocked gently, but it felt like it was teetering on the edge of a storm. Her hands gripped the sides tighter, knuckles white. She couldn't see anything. The water was black, impossibly dark, hiding whatever lay beneath. The silence was unbearable. Another splash. Lena's body tensed. She couldn't tell where it was coming from. Every direction felt wrong. The boat shifted again, unnervingly. She looked down into the dark water. Just the glimmer of the moon's reflection on the surface. And then a ripple. The figure was close. Too close. Lena's heart skipped. She heard it now, the sound of something dragging across the water. Something large. The boat lurched forward, and there, just below the surface, she saw the glint of a blade. A knife. It was there. It was waiting. Lena's breath hitched, and for the briefest moment, her entire body went cold. She had to move. She had to act. With a burst of adrenaline, she grabbed the paddle lying beside her and swung it wildly into the water, hoping to hit something, anything. The blade clanged against the side of the boat, but it wasn't enough. The figure below was still moving, circling her. The water churned. A shadow broke the surface just beside her. A hand, pale, slick with water, reached up, grabbing the edge of the lifeboat. Lena screamed, jerking backward. But it wasn't the killer. It was a man, his face half submerged, his eyes wide in terror. She didn't recognize him. His hand grasped for the edge of the boat, his grip slipping, fingers clawing at the sides. Lena couldn't breathe. She reached down instinctively, pulling him up with whatever strength she had left. His weight dragged the boat further down into the water. He gasped, struggling for air. Lena stared into his face, but then something shifted in his eyes. A shift she didn't like. His lips curled upward, just slightly, but enough to send a spike of panic through her chest. He wasn't afraid. He was smiling, and that smile, she'd seen it before. It was the same twisted, hollow grin she had seen on the killer. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't over. The killer had come for her, and now there was nowhere left to run. Lena's breath hitched. Her hands trembled as she scanned the water, every ripple feeling like a threat. The man, the killer wasn't gone. His words still echoed in her mind, a haunting whisper that refused to fade. She glanced frantically over the edge of the lifeboat. Nothing. The water was as dark and empty as the night sky above her, but she could feel it. Asteriskum asterisk, waiting. Her heartbeat thundered in her chest. The silence around her was suffocating. Another splash. This time louder. She jerked her head to the side, eyes wide. Nothing. Her pulse quickened. The boat creaked beneath her. She could feel his presence. Asterisk close asterisk. But she couldn't see him. Her throat went dry. Another splash. And then a soft laugh. It sent a wave of ice through her veins. Lena spun around, trying to catch a glimpse of the figure in the black water. Nothing. The laugh rang out again, cruel and taunting. Her stomach churned. She couldn't stay here. She had to move. With trembling hands, she grabbed the paddle, slamming it into the water. She forced the lifeboat forward, desperation fueling her. The water churned with every stroke, but the laughter didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. Suddenly, a hand shot up from the depths, grabbing the edge of the boat. Lena screamed, pulling back instinctively. The hand was pale, drenched, fingers long and twisted in a death grip. And then, the killer's face emerged from the dark water. His eyes were wild, bloodshot. His skin was burned, raw from the flare, but it didn't stop him. He pulled himself up with a slow, deliberate motion, eyes never leaving hers. "Did you think it would be that easy?" he growled, his voice rasping, guttural. Lena scrambled backward, the boat rocking dangerously. She had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The killer's twisted grin returned. With one final push, he lunged toward her, his hands reaching for her throat. But Lena was faster this time. With a cry of fear and anger, she shoved the flare gun at his chest and pulled the trigger. The flare exploded with a blinding light, slamming into him again. This time, it sent him tumbling backward, his body writhing in flames. The force of the impact knocked the lifeboat off balance, tipping it dangerously. Lena's heart raced as she scrambled to keep herself from falling overboard. The killer's screams echoed, but the flames quickly consumed him. He thrashed in the water, his body sinking beneath the surface. The water around her turned red. Lena couldn't breathe. Her body trembled, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse into the waves herself. But she didn't. She stayed afloat. The silence that followed was deafening. She was alone now. But was she truly? She looked down at the water, her mind racing. The killer was gone. For now. But how long could she trust the quiet? How long until something or someone else came for her? Lena gripped the sides of the lifeboat tighter, her mind consumed with the unanswered questions. And the gnawing fear that she was never truly safe. The lifeboat drifted silently in the water, a dark speck in the vast, endless ocean. Lena's body shook uncontrollably, exhaustion weighing her down. Her eyes were bloodshot, barely able to stay open. But she couldn't sleep. She couldn't let her guard down. The water was too dark, too empty. Her mind refused to stop racing, replaying every moment of terror. The killer, his twisted grin, the way he had seemed to be everywhere, even when he shouldn't have been. And now, was he truly gone? Or was it just the calm before the storm? She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The night felt too still. The wind had died, leaving behind an unsettling silence. The waves had stilled as well, almost as if the ocean itself were holding its breath. Lena glanced over the side of the boat again, her eyes searching the water, her mind scrambling for any sign of danger. But there was nothing, just the endless dark horizon. Her breath came in shaky bursts. How long had it been since she had last seen land? Hours? Days? It was impossible to tell. She hadn't eaten, hadn't drunk anything since the chaos had started. Her body was weak, her thoughts muddled. Her hand trembled as she wiped her brow, smearing the cold sweat across her face. And then something caught her eye. a faint glimmer in the distance. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, but as she stared harder, she realized it wasn't. A ship, a distant silhouette, its outline barely visible in the moonlight. Lena's heart skipped. Could it be? Was it a rescue? Was someone finally coming for her? With newfound hope, she reached for the paddle and began to row, weakly at first, but with increasing urgency. Her body screamed in protest with every stroke, but she couldn't stop. She had to reach that ship. She had to. The distance between her and the ship seemed to stretch on forever, though it was closer now. But as she paddled harder, she noticed something. The ship wasn't moving. It wasn't coming toward her. It was stationary, and as she drew nearer, she saw something even worse. The lights on the ship were out. The windows were dark. It wasn't a rescue ship. It was another wreck, another ghost in the dark. Lena's stomach twisted, and a cold, creeping dread washed over her. Her hands froze on the paddle. The distant ship, this wreck, felt familiar. She recognized the shape of it. It was the same ship, the one she had escaped from. And then a voice in the distance, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. Lena, her breath caught in her throat. It was his voice, the killer's voice. It was coming from the wreck. Lena's eyes shot to the silhouette, the dark, empty windows staring back at her. The voice called her name again. Lena. She gripped the sides of the lifeboat, her knuckles white. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The killer was still here, and the nightmare was far from over. The voice echoed across the water, chilling her to the core. Lena. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a command. She could hear the mockery in it, the taunting, as if he knew exactly where she was. Her blood ran cold. Her body was frozen, caught between the need to escape and the fear that moving would be the wrong choice. She slowly turned her head, staring at the wrecked ship in the distance. The silhouette loomed like a dark, monstrous figure on the horizon. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, a heavy, suffocating rhythm that drowned out everything else. And then the sound of a splash. Lena's eyes widened. The water had stirred. Someone was in it. She held her breath, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time, like something moving under the surface. The ripples were too subtle, too quiet for her to pinpoint exactly where. But the feeling in her gut told her everything she needed to know. The killer wasn't on the ship anymore. He was in the water, and he was coming for her. Panic surged through her. The paddle, still in her hands, felt like a weak tool against the overwhelming terror that gripped her. She tried to steady her breath, but her chest was tight, the air thin. Her eyes darted from the water to the wrecked ship, and back again. The dark waves shifted, and then she saw it. A flash of something pale, slick, and fast. A hand slicing through the water toward her. It moved with a purpose, a terrifying speed. Lena's pulse hammered in her throat. The hand was closer. Too close. She had to move. Her hands gripped the paddle again, her fingers numb. With a desperate, frantic stroke, she shoved the boat forward, the lifeboat jerking violently in the water. But the hand wasn't the only thing coming toward her. She heard it now, the scraping sound of metal against metal. A chain? No, a hook. A deep, metallic creak followed. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She glanced to the side. Through the murk of the water, a figure broke the surface. The killer. His face was half-masked by water, but his eyes gleamed with a maddening intensity. His mouth was twisted into that same, horrifying grin. In his hand, the hook glinted under the faint light of the moon. He was coming for her. Lena screamed, her fear drowning out all thought. She paddled harder, faster, but the water was no longer her ally. The boat was starting to tip. She could feel it. The killer was pulling himself up now, using the chain to haul his body over the side. Each movement was deliberate, like he was savoring her terror. Lena turned the paddle again, but the water was too thick, too heavy. She was sinking. She was sinking, and there was nowhere to go. Lena, his voice again, closer, almost within reach. She didn't dare look back. But then a loud, thunderous sound echoed from the wrecked ship. A shot. A flash of light in the distance. The killer paused. For a moment he seemed distracted. Lena's breath hitched. Was that a gunshot? Had someone come for her after all? The killer looked toward the ship, and in that split second of distraction, Lena shoved the paddle forward with all her strength. She surged the boat forward, the small vessel, cutting through the water, pulling her further from him. For just a moment, she was free. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel his eyes, feel them on her. And somewhere in the distance, the haunting sound of his laugh began again. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she propelled the lifeboat forward with every ounce of strength she had left. Each stroke of the paddle was a desperate plea for survival. Her eyes flicked to the wrecked ship again, but this time she couldn't focus on it. The dark waters around her felt alive, each ripple a potential threat. The laughter from the killer still echoed in her ears, lingering like a phantom. But she had to keep moving. She had to get away. She focused on the horizon, where the faintest hint of light began to appear. It wasn't much, just a sliver of pale blue, the first signs of dawn breaking. But it was something. It gave her hope, a small, fragile thing, but hope nonetheless. She paddled faster, her arms aching with each stroke. Her body screamed at her to stop, to rest, but she couldn't, not yet. The water around her was eerily still, almost unnatural. The silence was suffocating. The only sound was the faint slap of the oar against the surface, each movement slower than the last. And then the splash came again. This time it was unmistakable, a sharp, wet sound right behind her. Lena's heart stopped. She whipped around, her eyes scanning the water with frantic intensity. Nothing. The sea was calm, like glass. She didn't see him, but she felt him. The water had shifted. The ripple wasn't just the ocean moving. It was something or someone underneath. Her breath caught in her throat. The splash came again, closer this time. And then a dark shape emerged from the depths, rising slowly from the water, like a grotesque creature from the abyss. Lena froze. It was him, the killer. The twisted grin on his face was unmistakable, even in the dim light. He was dragging himself up, using the hook to pull himself forward. He was faster than she could have imagined. Lena's mind raced. What now? There was no escape. Not from this. He was closing in on her with each heartbeat. The boat rocked violently as he reached out, his hand gripping the edge with terrifying strength. Lena's pulse shot through her chest. Her thoughts were scrambled. This couldn't be happening. Not again. The killer leaned over the side of the boat, his grin widening as his eyes locked onto hers. "You're still not getting away," he said softly, almost lovingly, his voice like ice. With a sudden, brutal movement, he pulled himself into the boat, his hook scraping across the wood. Lena scrambled backward, her legs flailing, but there was nowhere to go. The boat was too small, the space too cramped, and he was too close. He was on top of her now, his body looming over her like a dark shadow. Lena could feel his cold breath on her face, his hand reaching out for her. His eyes were wild, unhinged, as though he were savoring this moment, this final victory. But something inside Lena snapped. The fear, the panic, it all gave way to something darker, something primal. With all her remaining strength, she kicked out, sending her foot square into his chest. He stumbled back, momentarily thrown off balance. Lena didn't hesitate. She grabbed the paddle, swinging it at him with everything she had. The solid would collided with his shoulder, knocking him back even further. For a moment, the killer looked stunned, his expression flickering with something like disbelief. But it was short-lived. He lunged again, more furious than before. Lena had no choice but to fight. She swung again, this time catching him across the face. He recoiled, blood streaking across his cheek, but his grin never faltered. He was relentless, and she was running out of time. That Lena's body was shaking, every muscle aching from exhaustion, fear, and adrenaline. Her hands gripped the sides of the lifeboat so tightly that her knuckles were white, her breath ragged in the stillness. The killer was gone, or so she thought, but her heart refused to slow, a constant thrum in her ears. The water around her was eerily calm now, almost too calm. The shipwreck loomed in the distance, a ghostly silhouette against the dark sky. The darkness felt like it was closing in on her, creeping in with every passing second. A cold breeze swept across the surface of the water, sending a chill down her spine. She couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see him again. But there was nothing, just the silent expanse of ocean stretching into the void. Her eyes darted to the horizon, where the first light of dawn was beginning to pierce the darkness. A pale streak of pink broke through the black, a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. A distant sound broke the silence, the low, rhythmic hum of an engine. Lena's pulse quickened. She turned around, her breath catching in her throat. A shadowed figure was cutting through the water toward her. A boat. It wasn't a wrecked ship, but a real, solid rescue vessel. Her heart leaped with a burst of hope, a feeling she hadn't dared allow herself to experience until now. But then, her stomach churned as she saw the silhouette more clearly. It wasn't just one person. There were two. Two figures in the boat, one at the wheel, the other standing behind, holding something. A rifle. Lena's mind went into overdrive. She didn't know if they were here to rescue her, or if they were the final part of this twisted game. Her instinct screamed at her to paddle, to escape, but her body was spent, incapable of any more movement. The boat drew closer, the engine's growl deafening now. She could see their faces. They were strangers, and the man holding the rifle, he was smiling. It was the same smile, the same twisted grin that she had seen on the killer. Her heart froze. She wasn't saved. The nightmare wasn't over. Lena's heart raced as the boat drew closer. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps, and her mind was a blur of panic and disbelief. She had barely escaped the clutches of the killer, and now, as the strangers in the rescue boat closed in on her, she could feel the familiar weight of danger once again. The man with the rifle was still smiling, a chilling, predatory grin that didn't belong on a rescuer's face. Lena's body tensed, and her thoughts raced. Was this part of the plan? Had the killer orchestrated everything, even the supposed rescue? The boat was only a few feet away now. The man's smile widened, his eyes glinting with something cruel and knowing. Lena didn't hesitate. She reached for the flare gun, her hand shaking uncontrollably, but she knew it was her only chance. She fumbled to load it, her mind screaming for her to move faster, but she couldn't make her fingers obey. The distance between her and the approaching boat was shrinking too quickly. The man in the boat spoke, his voice smooth but laced with malice. "Don't bother. There's nowhere to run, sweetheart." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She knew that tone. It was the same tone the killer had used. The killer who had haunted her every step. But then a flicker of movement caught her eye. The other figure in the boat, a woman, was now standing, a look of realization dawning on her face as she glanced from Lena to the man with the rifle. Her expression shifted from cold indifference to concern. "Wait, stop!" the woman cried out, her voice breaking the tension. "She's not one of them. Don't..." But the man with the rifle didn't listen. He raised the weapon, his grin still fixed in place. Lena's instincts kicked in. With one final burst of energy, she fired the flare gun. The flare shot forward, a brilliant streak of light cutting through the dark sky. It collided with the man, and he screamed as the flames erupted around him. The boat rocked violently, and the man fell backward, his body thrashing in the firelight before he sank into the water. Lena barely had time to process what had happened before the woman was beside her, pulling her away from the lifeboat's edge. "We have to get you out of here," the woman said urgently. Lena, breathing hard, could hardly believe it. She glanced back at the wrecked ship, at the chaos behind her, at the silence now enveloping the water. It was over. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lena allowed herself to breathe. The nightmare had finally ended.